Sydneysiders know the Domain, yet few know of its extraordinary role in the history of our city, celebrating all manner of ratbags and rabble-rousers. Today, the Domain offers 84 acres, incorporating the Royal Botanical Gardens and Mrs Macquarie's Point, and many of Sydney's landmark institutions. It also includes the open grass section behind Macquarie Street, which in the 1860s became known as the park where the gates never close. This area is named Phillip Precinct, after the first colonial governor. However, most Sydneysiders simply call it the Domain or even the Dom. It is the city's main area for massed gatherings, be it symphonic concerts, music or film festivals, demonstrations and ceremonies. The Ratbags and the Rabble Rousers love it.
Historically, the area, especially near the Botanical Gardens foreshore, was a corroboree site for the Indigenous people of Sydney and was used as such up to the middle of the 19th century. The Domain holds a peculiar place in the story of Sydney. 6 months after the arrival of the First Fleet, Governor Phillip set aside 9 acres of Farm Cove for the Crown. Phillip had no particular use in mind except for the need to designate a produce-growing area for the young colony. Small farms developed, however. Under incoming Captain William Bligh's government, the land was reclaimed, reinforcing Bligh's belief that it should be the governor's domain. His vision split the young colony and was part of the reasoning behind his persecution and the 1808 Rum Rebellion. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, a visionary in town planning, enclosed the domain soon after his arrival in 1810 and defined its use. The locals were less than impressed with the fences. Over the decades, the parklands lost and gained land. It is the Phillip Precinct, the relatively small open area sandwiched between Hospital Road and the Art Gallery Road, that has witnessed an ever-changing parade of curious history. Throughout the Victorian era, military reviews were held on the Queen's birthday, and until the last of the English regiments left Sydney in 1870, a regimental band played in the Domain every Sunday. In 1856, Pierre Magritte, an internationally famous aeronaut, announced he would demonstrate the science of aerostation by making an ascension from the Domain in a monster balloon, constructed in Sydney for the purpose. The airship was 100 feet high and 160 feet in circumference, and suspended a basket to accommodate gas mechanisms and the brave pioneer airmen. Over 12,000 people crowded the Domain and watched as Magritte attempted to create the gas to aid his flight. But misplaced ropes were caught by members of the crowd, and the giant airship, despite Magritte's protestations, was dragged to the ground. The show was over. Magritte was chased from the Domain, followed by some 4,000 yelling youths demanding their money back. Fights broke out, and the balloon and the basket were burnt to ashes amidst cheering hoots and yells. The rabble-rousers won the day. 2 years later, in 1858, Australia's greatest colonial showman and theatrical entrepreneur, George Coppin, announced that he would ascend in his balloon, the Australasian. His advertisement declared, "Inflation to commence at 2 o'clock. Thousands paid for admission. The governor lent his patronage. A military band supplied free music, and Coppin took off in the first aeronautical ascent ever made from this continent." The Domain was also a sporting oval for colonial cricket and football. Cricket matches, which had been played in Hyde Park since the early 19th century, moved to the Domain in the 1850s and played there for 14 years, despite a rough ground and vocal opposition from Sydneysiders, who saw the regular games infringing on their parkland. Football games were also staged on the grounds, however, being an open field, it was impossible to charge entry. There was also the problem of straying, grazing cattle and goats, not to mention their manure, which had to be physically removed before any game. From the 1870s, inspired by London's Hyde Park, the Domain became our soapbox for free speech. On Sundays, every ratbag and rabble-rouser in Sydney arrived, often with a small ladder as a soapbox, to talk about anything, from religion and politics to sexual freedom and, as the old-timers used to say, anything that came into their head, and there's nothing in that. As Sydney's backyard, the Domain was also a place for public spectacle. In 1874, high-wire walker Blondin, famous for his 1859 walk across Niagara Falls, tantalised audience in a giant tent accommodating 15,000 ticket holders per session when he walked across his Domain high wire. The Sydney Morning Herald reported, Blondin proceeded to light a fire, break some eggs and mix the ingredients for an omelette, which he cooked in a frying pan, turning the omelette over several times by tossing it from the pan into the air. He ate portions of biscuits, then uncorked a bottle of champagne and, bowing gracefully to the spectators, drank off a couple of glasses, seemingly with the utmost zest. Having thus refreshed himself, he took up his table and chair and walked off amidst the applause of those below. Blondin's tour of Australia yielded a fortune. In 1878, one of the city's great architectural wonders was built in the Domain for the 1879 Sydney International Exhibition. A garden palace, a cathedral-type building, 244 metres long with towers and electric lighting. It also boasted landscape pleasure gardens. The building, constructed in only 8 months, primarily of timber and glass, was completely destroyed by fire on one single night 3 years later. Tragically, between 500 to 1,000 Sydney Aboriginal artefacts were destroyed in the horrific blaze, along with the colony's print records. In the 1890s, the Domain became known for its cast of eccentric speakers. The Sydney Mail of 1898 described it as a hotbed for anarchists, salvationists, nihilists, free lovers, land nationalisers, every political and religious thought, destructive or constructive or condemned. One of the Speaker's Corner's most infamous pioneer speakers was naturalist William Chidley, who held unconventional views on sex, diet and clothing. Dressed as a Greek philosopher in tunic and sandals, he was regarded as a pervert because he dared mention sex in the repressed Sydney society of the early 20th century. Sydney City Alderman George Perry, sporting a long white flowing beard, thundered against strong drink, his voice reverberating through the fig trees and making the birds tremble in their feathers. German Charlie, the quack medicine man, sprouted forth on his latest cure-all, and double-bassed Bob, whose stock in trade was continuous reiteration, yelled, "3-star brandy is no friend of God," first in a deep bass and then in a high falsetto. All schools of thought were catered for. You could get your head read, your corns cured, soul saved, buy fruit and nuts, get a razor shave or a pamphlet to show how the political ills of the nation could be straightened out. The crustiest Tory or bewhiskered socialist would be certain to hear his favourite policy with contentment. The Domain was and still is an escape area. In an article in Australia and the Bookseller in 1907, a poet mused, "Sometimes when I have been dreaming humbug all day, I go into the Domain and think realities. I hear the Salvationist blowing souls to heaven, the parson talking as for man should be a hymn in a hat, the mob orator with a cure for chaos and a curse for civilization, the outdoor philosopher dragging pearls of pedantry from the oyster of his ignorance, the temperance lecturer pumping out denunciations against drink, the argumentative group of men that make the place like a garden of catechizing cats, the cheerful crowds that pass along as the wind blows sunshine through the breathing fig trees. All this fills me with brightest bliss." Military ceremonies and parades were staged in the Domain regularly. As the bugle sounded for World War I, it became the assembly point for Australia's famous snowball marches, where countrymen were encouraged to enlist. The most famous, the Cooey March, left Gilgandra in October 1915 with 26 men and trekked 515 kilometres to Sydney, with 263 men ready to sign up in the Sydney Domain. In 1917, the Domain became the weekly demonstration point for upwards of 150,000 unionists and supporters of the New South Wales Great Strike. Heated debates bolstered the determination of the strikers and their cry of solidarity forever. One orator, Harry Metheringham, in 1927, was arrested for riotous behaviour. Harry wanted 50,000 men and women to join him, walking to the Northern Territory to establish a utopian society to be called the New Jerusalem. In the mean and lean times of the Great Depression, the soapboxes were extremely busy expressing delusionment, frustration and downright anger. One ditty offered, "Although we've plenty of bees and cows, our land's not milk and honey, for the cows are all in Parliament and the bees have got all the money."
We're spending our nights in the DOS house. We're spending our days on the streets. We're searching for work but we find none. We wish we had something to eat. Soup! 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 They gave us a big plate of loop-a-the-loop.
Unemployment in the 1930s depression forced many into rough sleeping, and the Domain became an emergency tent city. As night closed, mysterious figures drifted in, furtively snatching up stray newspapers to act as covering. The Salvationists operated a soup kitchen in the Domain, feeding thousands daily. By the 1950s, the crowd numbers for the Speaker's Corner had decreased to around 5,000. The audiences were like trained monkeys, responding enthusiastically to repeated favourite rants. When the last of the international workers of the world, Speaker, shouted out, "IWW!" the audience responded as one, "It won't work!" Across the park, Sister Ada Green would thump her tambourine and shout, "Praise the Lord!" to which the monkeys responded with, "And pass the ammunition!" John Webster was a crowd favourite. He was a self-proclaimed argumentalist who spoke about religion, sex and politics, and damned them all. From the 1960s, for 25 years, Webster charmed his audience and flogged his weekly newspaper, Webster's Aussie Cult Journal. Today, the Domain is a restful place. Occasionally, a Sunday speaker appears, but most activity, apart from the major cultural events, are casual sports games, city workers enjoying lunch, and the occasional canoodling couple.